فؤادك الأيام فتى وتنحت جسمك الساعات نحتا
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, respected viewers. You're joining us here on our fantastic new series where we're going to be looking at books, talking to authors, and spreading the word and encouraging people on the importance of Islamic literacy. Now, you're joining us here on the Islamic Literary Society, where this new initiative we've started interviewing and speaking to people about their projects and about their programs. With us today, we have a very special guest, and the guest is none other than Dr. Osman Lateef, who is a researcher and mashallah has a number of different publications. Sheikh, I'd like to begin by giving a warm welcome and saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa barakatuh. Jazakallah for having me.
MashaAllah. Sheikh, we understand you've written quite a few books, but the book we're going to be talking about today is on human being, right? Can I ask you first and foremost, what inspired you to give your book that particular title?
Yeah, it's called On Being Human. On Being Human.
Oh, sorry, On Being Human, yeah.
On Being Human, how Islam addresses othering, dehumanization, and empathy. The genesis behind the idea of this book, in fact, came from Brother Hamza Zorses, who was at that time the CEO of IERA, Islamic Research Academy.
Right.
And so what happened is that last year, of course, following on from the dreadful terrorist attack in New Zealand in Christchurch and the killing of around 50 musallis in the masajid by Brenton Tarrant. This book, in fact, was written with the hope of seeking to better understand what is it that fuels that hatred that would drive a people to commit acts of mass murder like happened in Christchurch, or also in example like today, for example, July the 10th, of course, is the anniversary of the genocide in Bosnia 25 years ago. Both of those examples, one of them very, very big in the case of Bosnia, are examples of people who ended up dehumanizing other human beings. And that process of othering and dehumanization is created since all of us, in fact, have in our minds, a mental kind of a canvas. And on that mental canvas, we paint our images. And if we're only painting our images using wide brushes and broad strokes and a single color, we're disallowing identification, we're disallowing nuances and finer grades of distinction. And what's going to emerge then from our mental canvases is a caricaturing of another human being, not as fully human, but as a subhuman. And therefore, my book On Being Human discusses many strands of othering and dehumanization relevant to a great host of different people, communities, Jews, not, all kinds of people, blacks, and their suffering, Muslims, and we can get it in different ways. And so that was the kind of and therefore the book was launched this year in Christchurch in New Zealand at the anniversary of the attack.
And Sheikh, mashallah, I read most of the book, nearly getting towards the end of it. It's got a few chapters left. And I really did enjoy the book, and especially the historical events that you bring forward. Very powerful events, and we're going to go through those, inshallah, in the discussion. But I want to start off also by asking you, what do you think is the importance of writing about such topics? We find nowadays we're in an age where we all like to sit back and watch a video or, put on a podcast. But mashallah, I see that you're engaged in writing and you really enjoy that. What do you think is the role of writing in such an environment?
Well, I think in reality, all human beings are authors. I think we're all authors. We're all telling our stories. We all tell stories. We like hearing stories. And in our own ways, we're leaving an imprint, our legacy in life in different ways. Some people tell stories that are more meaningful in other ways, in the sense that they leave behind legacies of compassion, legacies of kindness, legacies of mothering, of fatherhood. All of these are examples really of telling a story. Imam al-Sakhawi would say, "Man arraha musliman fakannama ahyahu." Whoever relates the tale of a Muslim, it's like he's giving him life. For me, my first book is an academic piece following my PhD called The Cutting Edge of the Poet's Sword, Muslim Poetic Responses to the Crusades.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was inspired by, I mean, at that time, many years ago when I was doing it, is an account of a Shafi'i faqih called Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami, who was living in Damascus at the time of the crusade. The first crusade happened. He authors a text called Kitab al-Jihad, and the text didn't have that much of a reception. He had public readings in the Jami'a Masjid of Jami'a Umayyad Mosque in Damascus,
Right.
but the numbers weren't very large. And so what happened therefore with him is that, you know, much later, during the time of the recapture of Jerusalem by Salah ad-Din, his text became prominent all over again, but he had died a long before that. He died in 1105. This was 1187 now. So it just showed therefore the importance of the works you write today might not always be significant, important altogether today. I think people like great scholars, Imam al-Bukhari, Ibn Taymiyyah, they became much more influential, much more important, much widely read long after their passing. And Ibn al-Sulami is an example, therefore, that his book was read right before, I think, the Battle of Hittin, 1187, which led to, of course, recapture of Jerusalem. Therefore, it took time, you know, for the importance of that book to come through. I think this book on being human is one of, I believe, because I transferred from Department of History, which I was in for 8 years, into Department of International Relations, where I did my postdoctorate study, because I really felt the need that there has to be not only a Muslim voice in these areas, but also just a furthered voice. One of my inspirations behind going into this, in fact, is quite interesting. Is I teach English, history, literature. I was teaching this lady who was doing her degree in literature, and she needed help with a text, and this text was called "The Burial at Thebes" by the very famous Irish poet called Seamus Heaney. And I had no idea of the text. I knew of the poet, of course, but not of the text. And so what had happened was, as I was reading it with her and helping a little bit, I came to learn that Seamus Heaney, this was, of course, a classical play called Antigone from 3 or 4 BC. It's very ancient. But he rewrites this play in 2004, I think it was. And it's a struggle between an emperor, Creon, and there are 2 brothers, and both are fighting one's fighting for the emperor, one's fighting against him. There's 2 sisters, Antigone and Ismene, and the 2 brothers get killed in the battle. And so the emperor, he proclaims it, and the one who died fighting against him is not allowed to be buried. He has to be left to rot for the scavengers to eat his body. And the one died fighting for him is going to be honored and buried in a very sacred place called Thebes. And so the whole play is about this sister called Antigone trying to bury her brother. Now, there's so many things to this play. It really struck me because, and so Seamus Heaney, he said that part of his reason for rewriting this play was because of the war in Iraq.
Right. Okay.
And that discourse that kind of people like Noam Chomsky talk about also, about the fact that we have a worthy suffering, we have an unworthy suffering in our world today. We have victims that we will cry for and mourn, and we will kind of bury them, but others who are not allowed to be buried or mourned or cried for. And I felt in my heart, and I thought, here we are. Here, what an amazing person who would do something that has such significance for me as a Muslim, but also me as a human being, using his talent in his own way. There are many people like that. The example of Mark Twain in his soliloquy of King Leopold, you know, after the genocide in Congo. Mark Twain was just an author, but he used his skill and talent to project a voice that would, seek to establish justice in that way.
MashaAllah, Sheikh, clearly you can see your passion coming through in your research and in your readings. I just want to remind our listeners and viewers here as well that MashaAllah, we have with us Dr. Osman Lateef, and he has great experience. As he made mention, he's a teacher in English literature, but at the same time, he also has a BA in history, and he also has an MA in Crusader Studies, which is very, very interesting as well. And you've completed your PhD, I understand, Sheikh, in the place of Fada'il al-Quds, the merits of Jerusalem, MashaAllah. And that's also from Royal Holloway University, MashaAllah. A lot of reading and writing, Sheikh.
Yes, alhamdulillah. May Allah, yeah.
Sheikh,
Yeah.
I want to ask you, based on these readings, and you've also highlighted the importance of reading and writing books, and you made mention in your book of the concept of the other and dehumanization. Now, what's meant when we use words like that? When you say the other, what is implied in that?
Just to clarify one thing, brother. You mentioned in the beginning that I've written many books. I've written many books. I have 2 published books, and I have 1 on the way, inshallah, in a few months.
Okay.
So that's 3 altogether.
3 is many.
Yeah. So the concept of othering really is a discourse of self and otherness. It's a very big discourse in international relations. It connects many ways to the way that we understand ourselves, but that has a bearing on how we relate to another person. Othering is like when we see ourselves as important and privileged, sometimes if we're not careful, we will impute upon another people the worst of our human qualities and traits, right? And therefore, othering is like the stepping stone before you get to dehumanizing that person. And so, in the construct of self and otherness, one of the things about the book is it seeks to show that binary distinction need not exist between self and other. That in reality, we're all human beings. On being human means that we should connect. Allah in the Quran says, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha. Oh people, we created you from a male and a female. In one ayah, min nafsin wahida, from a single soul.
Right.
We have human codes of recognizability, right? So for example, if I shed a tear, if I cry, you could relate to that because you've also cried and you've also seen others cry. If I smile, you know what smiling means. If I fall, you've also fallen once. All of these are just very basic and plain human codes of recognizability, right? So whatever we feel in ourselves, empathy bearing is about perspective taking. The fact that I can take someone else's perspective because I've experienced that once before.
Sure.
My book, it covers different things. One of the chapters, in fact, is one of the sections. I have a chapter.
As you mentioned, one of the sections, I would like to actually pick one of those sections. In one of those sections, you talk about Nazi Germany, and you talk about how the Jews were depicted as the other, how they were dehumanized, and how it was made easier to treat them in the way which they were. I'm extrapolating now, but you made mention of that in your book in the context of today, where Muslims are possibly seen as the other, which may be the implication here. Are we accurate to draw that kind of similarity between the ways that the Jews were treated in Nazi Germany as the way the Muslims are being treated today?
Yeah, I don't make that claim in the book. I don't make them, and if I was to make that claim, in fact, it would be counter to the moral of the book, I think. Because remember that I have a separate section on the suffering of the Jews, which is a very unique suffering. And remember that what empathy means is that we have to give people an individualized identity. The moment we say all suffering is the same, then I'm stereotyping because I'm showing that we're all one single mesh without allowing for individual identification. So I have many examples in my book, even from the Holocaust, for example, that show that sometimes the suffering is so unique. For example, I have a section. I have examples of Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl is a very famous author of, I think, a very transformative book called Man's Search for Meaning, which I actually bought from the Pakistan Islamabad airport bookshop. Yeah, and so it was good to read that on the flight back from Islamabad.
It's a bit random, that.
Yeah, but the book has sold like 30 million copies and multiple, because Viktor Frankl was Auschwitz survivor. He goes in, he's a psychiatrist, and he makes this observation. But there's a really telling point where Viktor Frankl describes he was on one of the coaches, on one of the train carriages, and they're being taken from one camp to another camp. I think they're leaving Auschwitz to somewhere else for a short time. And there's a slit, between, in the doors of the carriage, and they can see, because he's from Poland, he can see where he's going. And there is a feeling that Viktor Frankl is describing from the other prisoners in the carriage. And it's so evocative because he's saying, for example, that there's one really camp that's very bad, brutal reputation. I think even worse than Auschwitz was the kind of feeling that you get from it. And it says that when they passed it, and they're going now to still another death camp, but it wasn't that one.
Okay.
He says when they passed it, he said the feeling of elation and jubilation could never be understood by anyone except those who were there in the carriage. And that's empathy. That's empathy. See, it requires for us to realize that, look, the suffering of the blacks, of course, there's a whole historical context of slavery, right? Of apartheid, of Jim Crow, of all of these things that the blacks went through in America and are going through in America still. We can't put ourselves in that position and say that we understand that unless, of course, we've experienced that or had very close, very intimate closeness to that suffering. So every experience is unique, but at the same time, we can make parallels. We can draw lessons. We can hope to better our situation today by understanding the suffering of another people. And I think the Holocaust is, I was in Auschwitz just a few years ago, Auschwitz and Birkenau together. We went through everything. We went through the whole thing. And in fact, I was giving talks in Krakow on the examples of Muslims who saved the lives of Jews in the Holocaust. But I'll tell you something, at the end of our trip to Birkenau, at the end of the tour, the Polish, very kind Polish lady who was giving us the tour, she stopped the whole group, and there's many Europeans and others in the group, and she stopped all of us, and she said to us, very passionately, she said, the reason that Syria is still happening today is a proof that the world never learned its lesson from Auschwitz. And I thought, to hear that from somebody who's not even a Muslim, to get that. Now, in 1965, a man called Theodor Adorno authored an article for Education After Auschwitz. In my book, you might see that in the penultimate paragraph, I reference Theodor Adorno. And I begin the paragraph by saying that we as humans are a collective effort. Theodor Adorno authors this text called, and the first line of his essay is that the premier demand upon all education is never again Auschwitz. Okay, and he believed that by German society, German mothers and fathers reteaching their children the importance of empathy, it could prevent when genocidal tendencies emerge in a people, it could be a preventative for that. But of course, there's been so many genocides since Auschwitz, in Rwanda and in Bosnia, and ongoing conflicts. It shows, of course, that we have so much more to do, I think, as a human.
On that point where you said we have so much more to do, and one of the objectives here at the Islamic Literary Society is that we are trying to encourage and promote Muslims in getting involved in reading, writing, and trying to revive this kind of this science or this art of people reading and understanding. There's another element of your book, and I want you to connect that with the importance of literacy and reading and writing. And that was you mentioned in your book, there's a chapter in there about the image, okay? And you also have an image in there of a prisoner who's all wrapped up, and then there's generals behind him, and then the image is actually described. And I want you to tell us about the importance of the power of images, how they influence the mind, and how, if Muslims were to get involved in reading and writing, how they could influence the minds of people as well, how they could take the narrative, and portray their image.
So my postdoc, in fact, was on iconography. My postdoc was on images of human suffering, iconic images of human suffering, and what they do when they're used and misused in American media. So I look at, for example, my upcoming book is called Between War, Dissent, and Empathy, Seeing Our Others in Darkened Spaces, right? So this darkened spaces, as in the spaces are dark, but it's also a process of darkening the spaces. And that's really what the whole book is about. But in that book, for example, I speak about the fact that there's images and then there's a narrative, right? Sometimes, for example, you and I can see an image, but it might mean something different if the narrative that we're being fed is different, okay? And then the way that we perceive of the image is different. So, for example, in that image on that section where that image of the prisoner is shown, the cartoon image, there's a lot of symbolism in that image because it shows that whatever we see is kind of what's going to generate a response in us, either one of indifference or one of empathy, right? Either we would feel nothing or we would feel something, right? So the prisoner, for example, who is he? You can see the hood on his head, and it looks like a bear, isn't it? So the bear therefore is kind of seen as a predator. But it's interesting that if you juxtapose that with the fact that this person, this bear-like person, is isolated, you know, and the ones who are behind him have a kind of a posture of being predators. So it all depends on how we're seeing something. But I think the key thing for us is to give the narrative. You know, the beautiful thing about Islam is, I'll give you an example. Look, on the day of Uhud, what happened? When the Prophet and his Sahaba, you know, were there, and Abu Sufyan is having a great day of rejoicing, and he's making these, you know, and he's saying, he said, Afikum Muhammadan, is Muhammad with you?
Yeah.
And of course the Prophet is there, and he's, you know, with Sahaba, and the Prophet says to him that La tujibuhu, don't answer him, you know. And then Afikum Abu Qahafa, is Abu Bakr there? And the Prophet said, La tujibuhu, don't answer him. Afikum Ibn Khattab, the Prophet said, La tujibu, don't answer him. But when Abu Sufyan said, U'lu Hubal, the Prophet said, Ajibuhu, answer him now. This is a beautiful thing.
Don't let him have the last word.
This is the power of narrative.
Yeah.
This is the power of narrative. You see, the Prophet was deciding on the narrative, not allowing Abu Sufyan to decide the narrative. And then he says, فَمَاذَا نَقُولُ, what should we say? And the Prophet says, say, Allahu A'la wa Ajal, Allah is bigger and higher than that, you know. And then Abu Sufyan says, you know, لَنَا الْعُزَّ لَعُزَّ لَكُمْ. And the Prophet said, أَجِيبُوهُ فَمَاذَا نَقُولُ, say, Allahu مَوْلَانَا لَا مَوْلَى لَكُمْ. The whole point is that if we put the narrative in our hands, of course, then we can't blame others and say that they're saying X, Y, and Z, because we've never decided upon a narrative. So in my book, for example, you would see that I give many examples of the prophetic empathy. People don't even know that. In fact, the most empathic person was the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Before we get to that topic, I want to come to that in just a few moments. Before we do that, but you know, because of the events taking place, you know, you mentioned New Zealand and also Srebrenica and various other places. There's so many tragedies, you know, taking place, and we've got to look. I feel that we've got to really look at what allows for people to commit such acts. You know what. And even, subhanAllah, when these things do happen to Muslims, the response, even from the Muslim community or non-Muslim, is not such a powerful response. Like, how dare someone do that? You know, sometimes it's such a passive response, you know. And, you know, there are many things that can lead a person to feel so desensitized in having a proper human reaction. And one of the things you also make mention is the power of movies. And you make mention how, in history, how the Arab or the Muslim has always been depicted as the bad guy, the backward guy, you know, or whatever words we want to use, but an easy target, you know. So is that once again talking about the narrative and what is the consequences of doing such an act?
Well, that's the thing. So in that, I focus on a book by Jack Shin called Real Bad Arabs. And so it speaks about the fact that, you know, Arabs have never had a positive representation in American media. Always the criminal, the thug, the you know, the one who's sleeping around, the terrorist, the uncivilized, barbaric, and these, of course, have an impression. So, if, for example, people are watching an average amount of TV per day in America, and they're seeing these images replayed again and again and again of the Arab this is the Arab, you know. Now, when that Arab, for example, ever becomes the victim, you know, of a genocide or victim of a killing, the question is it even possible for that person at that point in time to show empathy for that person? I would argue it's not, or extremely difficult. Why? Because that person has to unpeel layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of stereotyping before they see the human being in the frame. You see, because they've had years and years and years of indoctrination of that person being disallowed. His humanity has been disallowed. Now the problem is, therefore, if we don't fix this is why it requires education is the first thing, right? Empathy begins within. You have to teach people. Sometimes, for example, you know, some time back I was teaching my children, you know, you had these spate of stabbings in London, and, you know, may Allah protect everyone, you know, and England, you know, and so of course, you know, you see images of a mother weeping. You see a father with his head bowed down in a feeling of complete hopelessness, thinking, where's my life gone, you know? And I make a point of showing my children and saying, look at that man. That man could be me, your father. You know, that's you, that's like me. And I would show like the mother that's your mother, right? That's that feeling that woman is having, any one of us could have. And therefore what it does is it makes people more more alert. It makes people more
sensitive.
Sensitive, of course. There's a very good book called A is for Ox by Barry Sanders.
Okay.
So here's a question. Is A for Ox, brother? So he's an American. They say ox. This is why it's A is for ox.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. But the book I bought many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, a long time ago.
MashaAllah.
But this book is really good, really good. Everyone should read. It's really good. And this book speaks about gangs in America, in LA in the 1990s. And the author speaks about the kind of psychology. So he speaks about the kind of weapon that gangsters would have in 1990s in LA. And the weapon of choice was a gun called the Cobra M11.
Okay.
The Cobra M11 has a very large barrel. It could fire like 1,000 rounds per minute. It's a very extreme weapon. And then he speaks about the psychology of that weapon. And he said, why would gangsters choose a weapon like that? Because that weapon, it defies accuracy. You know, you can't be accurate with that weapon. The whole purpose of that gangster is not to make a hit on a target and then job is done. It's to create destruction. Is to see blood and gore. Is to make a mess. Is to blow up the table as you're killing. Is to create this carnage. And that's why the weapon of choice. Now, then he asks, for example, and he says that these gangsters, when they're caught and they're interrogated in prison, so in the police station, they never use words like murder, or like kill. They use words like annihilate, terminate, exterminate. It's all like, you know, Terminator kind of words. And he says that what would happen if you gave one of these people a book to read, right? And you put them in prison, you put them in a cell, and you gave them an autobiography or a memoir to read, right? So my favorite reading, honestly, is really my favorite reading after the Quran, the Book of Allah, and Islamic literature. My favorite reading is memoirs. I love reading memoirs. Like I find the most kind of happiness in trying to learn about somebody else's life story. And the lessons that I can ingrain in my life. But he asks the question, what would happen if you did that? And he says that it would blow up his existence. It would blow up his life, because he'd realized for the first time that the one he's pointing his gun to at the end of the barrel is not a machine. He's a human being, right? Yeah. And sometimes, and this is one of the things I discuss in my book, you might have read, is that, and I make this point a few times, that we're not machines, we're actually human beings, you know. And sometimes, even as Muslims, we run the risk, even in the way that we give da'wah sometimes, or speak to others, it's like we're just reading a script, but the human element sometimes is missing. And I begin this book by giving the example of Harry Leslie Smith, the example of the spoon and the cup. You know why? Because it really touched me. Because here's a man who's 90-something years old, and he's describing, and this is from his memoir called, what's his title of his book called? Harry, it's in a book anyway.
Okay.
But he makes this point, and he says, he describes every morning when I go downstairs and I make myself a cup of coffee. He says the sound, the clinking sound of the spoon against the cup as I stir the cup reminds me of myself when I was 5, 6 years old, standing on one of the cobbled streets of London, and I could hear the hooves clinking, you know, on the roads.
So, Sheikh, mashallah, just listening to what you're saying, the adjectives that you're using, subhanAllah, they draw up such a powerful image in a person's head, like the way you're describing it, you know. Yeah. Can you just give us some, you know, words of encouragement for, you know, Muslims to, you know, to understand the power of books? You know, such a basic question, but the power of books, reading them. If I could ask you to talk about reading them, and at the same time, for those who maybe, subhanAllah, have the ability to actually write as well? What would you say?
Well, I would say that, you know, there's always a starting point for everything. If people struggle with long books, read small short stories, you know, read small books. You notice, I mean, in my books, you know, I annotate all over my books. You know, there's pen marks all over my books, because I think that it's not just about reading, it's about learning from the books. You see, if I read something, you just forget it, isn't it? Because the human mind is like that. It's just too much information for you to remember. But what I do, therefore, is that when I read, if there's something that sticks out to me, that I'd either fold the page or I would write on the book, and I'd write down whatever's immediately in my mind. I might connect it to something I've previously read or written, or something that Islamic that might remind me of a verse from the Quran or a hadith or something like that. And therefore, then that bit of information is more likely to remain with me, right? So I think that there's one thing which is about like just comfort reading. One is purposeful reading. One is reading for the purpose of research reading. You know, one is reading for the purpose of writing. That's for your reading. You know, therefore people have different intentions, different purposes for reading. I think that, you know, I think there's a big need for us, of course, to be able to read, to be able to understand, you know, and to be able to act upon the things that we read and that we learn. It's not just about reading. You know, Ibn Mas'ud, I think, would say, Ibn Abbas would say, "Ta'allamu ta'allamu fa'idha alimtum fa'amalu." You know, learn when you've learned and act upon what you learn, right? So one thing I don't like to read. I don't like to read things that I don't see. I don't find a benefit in that reading. One of the Prophet's du'as, he would say, "Allahumma inni as'aluka ilman nafi'an," or Allah asks for beneficial. "Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa' wa min qalbin la yakhsha." There has to be an internalizing of that reading and enhancing of the human character through the reading. And I think, therefore, the way that we select books should make a difference to that. And so I think, you know,
and Sheikh, also, if I can get your words on your encouragement on writing, and as well as that, you made mention that you made a shift in your own career or in your life, and you've started writing. What made you write? And what would you encourage? How would you encourage others to start writing as well?
Yeah, I've always liked writing, alhamdulillah. I mean, I still have, in fact, poems that I wrote when I was in secondary school. When I was 14, 15 years old, I wrote poems. Yeah, I was part of I represented the school in poetry when I was in school. So I've always enjoyed writing. I think that in writing, you're telling your story. You know, you're putting your feelings on the page. That's very, very profound for you to be able to do that, because once you do that, it's very, number one, empowering to do that. And also it's very empowering for others to read about you. Like I said, you know, one of the, you know, I bought when the Kindle first came out, you know, I bought it immediately. I pre-ordered the Kindle years ago, the first Kindle.
Yeah.
Years ago. It was too long. And I was, in fact, on a speaking tour in Ireland, and I traveled from Cork to Galway to Dublin. This is kind of Cork. And what happened is, so I had the Kindle, and I knew that I had to be on the coach, a lot of coach journeys. And one of the first, if not the first book I read on the Kindle was a book called 3096 Days by Natasha Kampusch. Natasha Kampusch was an Austrian girl who was kidnapped by a man called Wolfgang Pricklepil, and she was kept in his cellar for like 9-10 years, and then she escaped. But the whole book is about her journey, right? What she remembers and as she relays it. And honestly, there was so many lessons I just learned, like even Islamic lessons about shukr, about sabr, about, you know,
Wow.
about so many things, just from a simple life experience of somebody else, right? That somebody else has experienced that. And it's made me realize about my own self, my own vulnerabilities, my own weaknesses and strengths. And you know, you can, the Prophet says that, you know, wisdom is a lost property of the believer, and wherever he finds it, he has a right to it. You know, you can learn from so many things. You can learn from a single line of poetry written by anybody, and that could just transform your mindset, your character, your feelings. We shouldn't always think that, you know, for me to be anywhere, I have to read a hefty big book and then I can understand something. No, it's wrong. Ghalat, it's a mistake. You know, I could find something so small. I could just
effectively, Sheikh, what you're doing for us now is you're giving us a manhaj for reading.
My point is, I could find something so small, brother, so small from any of these books. Like this is
You know, Sheikh, many times these small books are actually more powerful.
Yeah, it's true. Look, this is a small book on Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Look how thin it is. It's so tiny, you know.
Subhanallah.
But it's so many profound lessons. For example, it's interesting because she was one of my inspirations, even in writing on Being Human and the other one. Why? Because this is very powerful for reading. It's good I picked out this one, subhanAllah, because she was a white woman during the time of the struggle of ending slavery, the abolitionists.
Okay.
So now she was a white woman, so she didn't have much of a say because women didn't have much of a say in that time, not as much as men. Her father was abolishing slavery, and then what she does is she has a miscarriage or loses a child.
Okay.
She authors this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book became infamous later on because, you know, Muhammad Ali taunted Joe Frazier by saying, you know, your Uncle Tom and everything. But anyway, she writes the book in that time, 19th century, and what she tried to do, she felt that the feeling I'm having as a mother losing a child is similar to the feeling of the black African American woman having to give up her child on a slave auction, right? That sense of separation, I could feel some of it. She writes this book trying to humanize the life of black people. This became the second best-selling book in the whole of America in the 19th century after the Bible. There's even I think there's even an anecdote of what's that, the president, Abraham Lincoln, who meets her when she's an old woman, and he shook her hand and he said, "Are you the lady that wrote the book that caused this war, the American Civil War?" so you know, but that's very profound. It's very profound. That's a very profound narrative.
Yeah.
And that's showing the power of literacy, the power of words, the power of the book. It's just showing the power of empathy, to empathize with somebody else. You know, there's so many lessons you can learn from this.
As well, Sheikh, you know, I really enjoyed these last few points that you made mention of, especially right at the beginning of our discussion. You said that, you know, sometimes a person may write a book and it might not be so attractive at that particular time. And maybe, you know, sometime later it might cause a revolution or might...
Yeah, that's it. Just like a Sulemi in the 12th century with the Crusades. Therefore, never feel disheartened. You know, you can, for example, start writing articles, start writing small articles. There's people like Islam 21C that could publish the articles. You know, write small things. Write small things even as like, you know, gifts to give to people, your spouse or your children. Write small things just for...
But what about if somebody said they don't have the ability to write? They don't think they're that good. They don't like, it's too much for them.
Okay, there's many things we can do for that. So, you know, we're all transitioning through life, you know, and if I, for example, now was to look back at my my BA dissertation, you know, I think like, what kind of idiot wrote something like that? You know? because we're transitioning, you know, we're all passing through life. We all experience that. There's always, I'll tell you something, there is no book that is without error except the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
SubhanAllah.
There's no book without mistake except the book of Allah, right? All of us are going to write things, we'll get things wrong. We'll get, you know, that's just part of life, you know. And it makes you realize therefore your own weakness, but at the same time, there's always there's a process of growing.
Actually, so it's alhamdulillah that process of growing as well. And I wanted to add as well, when you look at the Quran, like we said, the teaching methods of the Quran as well are so different. You know, like Allah will teach us things through stories. He will teach us things through direct instruction, do this and don't do that. You know, and so many different ways in which Allah uses metaphors. Allah has metaphorical language, so many different ways. So like what may attract me may not attract you, and what may attract you may not attract me. But at the end of the day, it will attract everyone, if you get what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. All of us, and I mean the Quran, of course, is unique because the Quran, the Quran appeals to the entirety of the human self, everything. So for example, Allah in the Quran, He speaks about those who, when the Quran is recited, their eyes swell up with tears, you know. Allah says, وَإِذَا قُلِ الْقُرْآنِ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنصِتُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. The ears are working, you know, the tongue is silent, everything is working. Allah says, the believers are those إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا. You know, the whole being is working like this. And that's of course the main book that we should be reciting. اقرأ القرآن فإن يأتي يوم القيامة شفيعا لصاحبه. To recite the Quran again and again. I mean, that's the main book that we should be engaged with all the time. Of course, takes precedence from all other kind of reading. But at the same time, of course, you know, we should be like you mentioned, reading things that are purposeful, that make a difference in our lives, and then using the inspiration from wherever we're reading to practice our own writing. I think people shouldn't feel shouldn't feel disempowered in themselves, thinking that they're unable. All of us are able in our own ways, but everything starts from somewhere. And it can just start with just writing a line, writing the line, turn it into a sentence, make the sentence into a paragraph, make the paragraph into a page into an essay. All of these are just processes to get to, inshallah, where Allah wants for us.
And so do you feel there is a need, I know we're coming towards the end now, but so do you feel there is a need in the Muslim discourse or the Muslim communities that we need to encourage our youngsters and even our elders to start writing?
I think that, you know, we shouldn't do things just because we're forced to do them. We shouldn't do things without some sufficient preparation, background, you know, for them. It's not just about writing anything for the sake of writing anything. It's about, even if it takes you a long. I'll give an example. My PhD finished in 2011. The book that came on Fadail al-Quds and the shi'r, the poetry of the jihad, from the jihad, that was published in 2017. So there's many years between 2011 and 2017, because that took time for the publishers and then amending and editing and so on and so forth. My postdoc finished in 2014, and my book has just is going into print now, inshallah, 2026 years. So everything takes time, but don't feel as if it's not happening today, it's never going to happen. Just be patient. Whenever Allah wants something to happen, Allah is Fatah, Alim. Allah will open doors, inshallah.
Sheikh, and final few questions. And some people think that before they write, they have to have a BA in literature, or they have to have some kind of a degree in writing or something English related. What would you respond to them?
No, I think that yeah, I don't think you need any of these, but I think that what we need is that you need some proficiency in being able to write, just like anything. There's no point in me, for example, when I wanted to do, when I read the poem of Seamus Heaney, and I had this urge to be able to write about this. I realized I didn't have the skills or the talents, or I didn't have the knowledge of this. And then I had to apply for a postdoc to be able, but even if you can't do that, don't worry, because just simply if I read a lot around one subject, that means I've learned something from that subject. I can now take that knowledge and put it down onto paper, right? Others could correct me, which is what peer review is very important. But if it gets corrected, then I'm learning as I'm going along, right? The danger is, I'm not going to put down my pen to paper and write anything about anything without sufficient background reading, without sufficient, you know, training in whatever I'm doing. But I think there's you're going to not be at either extreme. There's something in the middle, which is that, you know, have the drive to write. The Prophet said, "Ihras ala ma yanfa'uk wasta'in billah wa la ta'jaz." You know, have the drive to do, but then just to remember that it could take me time. I remember, in fact, when my postdoc started, and the lady, you know, the person I was, I had to make a proposal about the time I would spend and how I would organize my time, and so she said, so for the first like 6-7 months, it was just there was like a gap. And I said to her, so what do I write down for this? She said, just reading. That's what she said to me. Yeah, that's what she said.
6 months of reading.
Yeah, she said, just read. You don't need to do anything. Just because you need knowledge about this topic. So just
Right.
spend your time reading all about it. Then at least you can write about it. You can't start writing. You have to read first, and that makes a lot of sense. So you have to, of course, know something before you can write about something.
Okay. Okay. And Sheikh, now that you've started your your writing part, your career in writing, or you've got 3 books, you said, third one on its way. What are your ambitions and your dreams and your goals with writing? Where would you like it to take you? Or what would you like to achieve?
Yeah, I actually have a novella I'm writing also, which is a fiction text. So every year I go to Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, with tazkiyah tours, and we go with the big groups. And I'm actually doing now a weekly webinar with Sabil on the history of Islam in Al-Andalus in Spain.
Yeah.
So I wrote this, and in fact it's still there. It's not, hasn't gone very far, but it's alhamdulillah, some good parts of it are written. And this is a fiction account of a Morisco family, of a Morisco family, or these were secret Muslims who had to survive under the Spanish Inquisition and the centuries after that, disguising their faith. So outwardly they're Christians, but inside they're Muslims, and hiding and practicing their faith in secret. And there's a long history behind this. And so it details one family called the Fernandez family. There's Maria, the wife, there's Elvira, the daughter, Nicholas, the younger boy. And it's about how they kind of, in a fiction writing, how they, try and practice their faith in secret. So I think my mom says you're going to finish that. So that's what I'm going to try and finish soon, inshallah.
Okay, mashallah, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. We've taken plenty of your time, and we are coming to prayer time. I want to really thank you so much for sharing us this hour in your writings and your experiences. I really enjoyed hearing your experiences.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. Thank you for having me.
Work, inshallah. Sheikh, in one sentence, if you don't mind me saying, because we've got a lot of youngsters watching as well. So just in the one sentence, in 30 seconds, what would you say for the youngsters who are watching these programs?
I'll say that, there's nothing that could be compared to reading. Right now, for example, we live in a world of the visual, that most people are more attracted to what they're seeing. When George Bernard Shaw, the very famous, he was taken to New York when New York for the first time had neon lights, okay? Yeah. And people were going there for the spectacle of seeing these big lights. And they took him to go and see the lights. And you know what he said when he saw them? He said that these must be beautiful if you can't read. Meaning if this is what you think beauty is in comparison to reading, that means that this must be beautiful for you because you haven't experienced the joy of reading. And remember that when you're watching, you're like a passive recipient of thousands of screenshots, but all the thinking has been done for you by the advertisers and the marketers and people like the actors and actresses and the music. All of that has been done for you. You're just a recipient. But when you read, you have to create the music and the sounds and the colors and all of that. And that really gets your mind working, I think, in a positive way.
Okay, Dr. Osman, I'd like to once again thank you very much for that and taking out a full hour of your time sharing us here at the Islamic Literary Society. I'd like to thank you again and to conclude our discussion.
One second, if I could mention. So my book on being human, this is going to be available free, by the way, on the Sapiens Institute website. It's being republished as an ebook on sapiensinstitute.org. You can access the book soon, inshallah. It will be available there, and also you can order the paperback copies from iEra. The distribution center just opened up a few days ago. That's why you couldn't get a copy, but inshallah it will be available very soon, inshallah.
Okay, so you heard it there, everyone, from the author himself. Get yourselves a copy. Okay, an amazing book. I've nearly got to the end of it, and I strongly recommend everyone you get a copy and get a hardback so you can keep it on your shelves. Inshallah, it lasts you a long time, inshallah. So, Sheikh, I'd like to thank you again for giving your time. We will hopefully see you when you've completed your next book.
Inshallah. Allah bless you. Allah bless you.
Ameen. Barakallah feek, Sheikh. Assalamu alaikum. Excellent. Okay, respected viewers, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in as well. Inshallah, we will see you all in an upcoming discussion on a brand new book, a different book with another amazing, fantastic author that will take us through his journey or her journey on writing as well. So until our next interview, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.